Long before geologists mapped the layered badlands of northern Arizona, and decades before federal surveyors pushed into the high desert plateau that would eventually become one of the most visually striking landscapes in the American Southwest, the Hopi were already telling a story about what lived beneath it. Not what had lived there once, what lived there still. The Painted Desert stretches across nearly 50,000 square miles of northeastern Arizona, a landscape of eroded clay hills, ancient sedimentary formations, and silence so complete that early explorers described it as a place the living world had forgotten. The colors that give it its name, bands of red, purple, ochre, and grey, layered across the terrain like a painter's study in geology, come from iron oxides and manganese deposits locked inside rock formations that are among the oldest exposed sedimentary surfaces in North America. Some of those layers are 225 million years old. The Hopi have lived on the mesa edges above this landscape for over 1,000 years. Their villages are among the oldest continuously occupied settlements in North America. Oribe, sitting on Third Mesa, has been inhabited since at least 1100 CE. These are not a people who arrived recently. They are a people who have watched this landscape across a span of time that makes the entire written history of European contact look brief. And across that entire span of time, they have maintained a specific and consistent tradition about what the Painted Desert conceals beneath its surface. The Hopi understand the world as layered, not metaphorically, literally. Their emergence tradition describes humanity passing through a series of previous worlds before arriving in the present one. Each earlier world ended in catastrophe. Each time, survivors were guided downward or upward through an opening in the earth to a place of safety before eventually emerging into a new age. The present world is called the Fourth World. The three that came before it are not distant mythology. They are history of a kind that the Western academic tradition has difficulty categorizing, but that the Hopi treat with the same weight and seriousness that other cultures assign to written records. What makes the Painted Desert traditions particularly specific is that they do not describe the underground world in vague or symbolic terms. They describe it in geographic terms. The elders who preserved these accounts located the underground chambers beneath identifiable features of the desert landscape. Specific formations, specific directions, specific distances from places the Hopi knew by name and used regularly. That specificity is significant. Oral traditions that are purely symbolic or metaphorical tend to describe sacred places in terms that resist literal geographic interpretation. Traditions that are preserving actual historical knowledge tend to describe real places in terms that can, at least in principle, be located on the ground. The Painted Desert traditions belong to the second category. The beings the Hopi describe as living beneath the Painted Desert are recorded across multiple clan traditions collected independently by different anthropologists working in different periods. Frank Hamilton Cushing documented elements of these accounts in the 1880s. Jesse Walter Fuchs recorded additional versions in the 1890s and early 1900s. The accounts they preserved came from different villages, different clans, different informants who had no coordinating influence on each other's testimony. They agreed on the essential description. The beings were not human. They were not the ancestors of the Hopi, though the Hopi ancestors had encountered them. They were described as inhabitants of the underground world in the same way that the Hopi themselves are inhabitants of the surface world. Not visitors, not spirits passing through. Permanent residents of a domain that exists beneath the desert floor and that operates according to its own organization, its own knowledge, and its own continuity across time. The Hopi called them by a name that translates most closely as the ones who remained below. That name carries a specific implication. It implies that when the ancestors emerged into the present world, not everyone came up. Some stayed, deliberately, as a matter of choice rather than circumstance. Before we continue, if this kind of investigation is what you come here for, subscribe now. The buried record does not reach you unless you tell the algorithm to bring it. New investigations drop regularly. Make sure they find you. The question that the Hopi tradition does not answer directly is what the ones who remained below were doing down there. What purpose kept them underground when the surface world was open and available? That question becomes considerably more interesting when you examine what the desert itself has been concealing. The Painted Desert sits directly above one of the most geologically complex subsurface environments in the American Southwest. That is not a fringe claim. It is documented in the Geological Survey records of the United States Geological Survey, the same institution whose field reports form the baseline reference for everything known about the subsurface structure of northern Arizona. Beneath the colored clay layers that give the desert its name lies the Chinle Formation, a geological deposit stretching across the entire Colorado Plateau that contains extensive natural void spaces, dissolved cavities, and interconnected passages created over millions of years by groundwater movement through soluble rock. The Chinle Formation is not a uniform solid mass beneath the desert floor. It is, in places, a layered complex of open spaces, whose full extent has never been comprehensively mapped. That geological reality matters because it means the Hopi tradition of underground chambers beneath the Painted Desert is not describing a physical impossibility. The spaces exist. The question the Hopi tradition raises is not whether there are chambers below the desert. There are. The question is what those chambers contain. In 1892, a survey team working under the authority of the Bureau of American Ethnology conducted fieldwork across the Painted Desert region. Their primary mandate was to document surface archaeological sites, the ruins, pottery scatters, and petroglyph panels that the Hopi and their ancestral predecessors had left across the landscape over centuries of occupation. The survey leader was a man named Victor Mindeleff. His published report, submitted to the Bureau in 1894, documents surface sites in careful detail. But buried in the unpublished field notes held at the Smithsonian Institution's National Anthropological Archives is something that did not make it into the published report. Mindeleff recorded a conversation with a Hopi elder from the village of Walpi. The elder described a specific location in the eastern Painted Desert where the ground, in his words, spoke at certain times of year, not metaphorically. The elder described an audible phenomenon, a low resonant sound emanating from the desert floor at specific seasons that the Hopi associated directly with the presence of the ones who remained below. Mindeleff noted it without interpretation, labelled it as a local belief, and moved on to his next survey point. The field note has been sitting in the Smithsonian Archive for over 130 years. The audible phenomenon the Walpi elder described has a geological explanation that Mindeleff would not have had access to in 1892. Thermal expansion and contraction of air trapped inside subsurface cave systems can produce exactly the kind of low resonant sound the elder described, particularly during seasonal temperature transitions when surface temperatures change rapidly enough to force air movement through underground passages. This is documented behavior in cave systems worldwide. Geologists call it cave breathing. It is most pronounced in large interconnected void systems where significant volumes of air are in motion. The more extensive the underground network, the more pronounced and regular the sound. The Hopi did not have the geological vocabulary to describe cave breathing in 1892. But they had been observing and preserving knowledge of this phenomenon across generations of living above the desert. What Mindeleff recorded as a local belief was almost certainly an accurate long-term observation of a real physical phenomenon occurring beneath the desert floor. The elders' description of when it happened at specific seasons matches exactly the conditions under which thermal cave breathing is most pronounced. That level of correspondence between traditional knowledge and modern geological understanding is not coincidence. It is the signature of careful, sustained observation transmitted faithfully across many generations. Two separate anthropologists working independently in the 1920s collected accounts from Hopi elders that described the underground world beneath the Painted Desert in terms that went beyond the cave-breathing phenomenon. Elsie Clues Parsons, working primarily with Second Mesa villages, recorded descriptions of the underground chambers as organized spaces. Not random natural cavities, but arranged environments with specific areas designated for specific purposes. The elders Parsons interviewed were careful to distinguish between two categories of underground space. The first was natural, the passages and cavities that the desert created through its own geological processes. The second was different. It had been shaped, modified, arranged according to a logic that reflected the needs and knowledge of whoever had done the arranging. That distinction is precise and deliberate. The Hopi elders were not describing a single undifferentiated underground world. They were describing a landscape beneath the desert that had both natural and constructed elements, the same way that a city has both the natural terrain it sits on and the buildings that human effort has placed upon that terrain. The ones who remained below had not simply occupied existing caves. They had worked them, extended them, organized them into something that functioned according to its own internal logic across a span of time that elders consistently described as very long. How long is very long in a tradition that places the emergence of the present world at an indeterminate point in the deep past is difficult to calculate. But the Hopi do not describe the underground civilization as ancient in the sense of gone. They describe it as ancient in the sense of continuous, still there, still functioning, still operating beneath the coloured layers of the desert in the same organised way it always had. In 1947, a Hopi elder named Titus Kermawunu gave a series of recorded interviews to a linguist named Edward Kennard, who was compiling a documentation of Hopi oral traditions for the American Philosophical Society. The recordings still exist. They are held in the Society's archives in Philadelphia and have been partially transcribed but never fully published in accessible form. In one of those recordings, Kermawunu described the Painted Desert underground world in more specific terms than almost any previously documented account. He was not performing for a general audience. He was speaking to a linguist whose primary interest was vocabulary and grammatical structure. The detail he provided was incidental to Kennard's research purpose, which is precisely why it survived without the editorial filtering that more intentional documentation tends to produce. Kermawunu described the underground chambers as existing in levels, not a single cavern, but a descending series of organized spaces, each level deeper than the last, each with its own character and its own function. The uppermost level, he said, was closest to the surface and had been accessible to Hopi people within living memory of his own elders. The deeper levels were not accessible, not because physical barriers prevented entry, because the ones who remained below had not extended an invitation to come further. That distinction is important. Kermawunu was not describing a sealed or abandoned space. He was describing an inhabited one with its own boundaries and its own terms of access. The question of physical evidence is where the Painted Desert tradition intersects most directly with the documented archaeological record of the region. The Petrified Forest National Park, which occupies a significant portion of the eastern Painted Desert, has been systematically surveyed since its establishment in 1906. That survey work has documented over 800 surface archaeological sites within the park boundaries alone. What it has not documented comprehensively is the subsurface. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the park between 2009 and 2014 as part of a broader archaeological mapping project produced results that the published summary report described as anomalous subsurface features requiring further investigation. The summary was published in a National Park Service technical report in 2015. The further investigation has not been conducted. Budget constraints, the report noted, had prevented follow-up work. The anomalous features remain documented but unexplored, sitting in a technical report that receives approximately the same level of public attention as Mindeleff's 1892 field notes. Anomalous subsurface features in archaeological terminology means features that do not match the expected geological profile of the surrounding area. Features that suggest something is present beneath the surface that the natural geology of the region does not account for. The survey did not claim to have found underground chambers. It claimed to have found things that did not fit the expected pattern. In science, things that do not fit the expected pattern are the beginning of investigation, not the end of it. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office has maintained a consistent position regarding the underground traditions of the Painted Desert. They are sacred. They are not appropriate subjects for external investigation or public speculation. The office does not confirm or deny specific claims made by researchers or documentarians. It asks that the traditions be treated with the respect owed to living cultural knowledge, rather than the detached curiosity applied to archaeological artifacts. That position deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The Hopi are not a people who have lost connection to their traditions. They are a people who have maintained those traditions across a span of time that encompasses the entire history of European presence in North America and extends far beyond it. Their knowledge of this landscape is not second-hand. It is the product of over 1,000 years of direct, continuous observation from the mesa edges above the desert. When they describe what lies beneath the Painted Desert, they are not speculating. They are transmitting, passing forward what was passed to them in the same careful, deliberate way that knowledge which matters is always passed, from one generation to the next across an unbroken chain of human memory. What the ones who remained below were doing in the organized chambers beneath the desert, what knowledge they possessed, what their continued presence in the underground world means for how we understand the deep history of this landscape. These are questions the Hopi tradition raises without fully resolving. That is not a failure of the tradition. It is the nature of honest testimony about things that remain beyond complete human understanding. The desert is still there. The geological void spaces are still there. The anomalous subsurface features are still documented and unexplored. The Hopi traditions are still being transmitted. And beneath 50,000 square miles of coloured clay and ancient sediment, whatever the ones who remained below were doing, when the ancestors emerge into the present world, may still be continuing in the organised levels that Titus Kormawunu described to a linguist on a recorded afternoon in 1947. Some knowledge stays underground because no one has found the right way to bring it to the surface. Some stays underground because the ones who hold it have decided, with full understanding of what they are choosing, that the surface world is not yet ready to receive it. The Painted Desert keeps both kinds.